Welcome to Untaught Essentials. I'm Jeremy Hunter. This episode, we talk with legendary leadership professor Jay Conger on the power of stories. It's a great follow-on from last episode's talk with Robert Walter and the power of myth. Here, Jay shares with us why storytelling is such a powerful leadership skill, what makes a compelling story, and how to effectively deliver them. This episode is jam-packed with incredibly useful information and, happily, some great stories. I think you'll enjoy it. So, welcome to Untaught Essentials. This episode, we have my friend, Professor Jay Conger, Professor of Leadership Studies at Claremont McKenna College, part of the Claremont Colleges, where I also teach. He is a very august and renowned figure in the world of leadership studies, and it's quite an honor to have him. He's also co-author of The High Potentials Advantage. So you can tell us a little bit about that later. Published by Harvard Business Press. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's right, Jeremy. Yeah.
A dubious outfit, but congratulations.
But they've been around a long time.
Been around a long time, yeah. So great outfit. So today I thought, well, first of all, thanks for taking time, Jay. I know you're a busy guy. And last episode, we talked with Robert Walter, who's president of the Joseph Campbell Foundation, about myth and its relevance to modern life. And I think a good follow-on conversation is kind of the power of story, which is, you know, your ideal for kind of exploring that topic together with. And I was wondering if you could just talk about that. Like, you know, we hear a lot about story and storytelling and the importance of that. And why should, especially a leader, care about storytelling? You know?
Yeah. So let me begin with a story. So when I was getting my doctorate, the individual who was my thesis advisor was a man named John Cotter, who had established international recognition as a leadership, guru. And I had never seen him teach. So I walked into his office one day and I said, "Hey, John, could I sit in the back of one of your executive education programs and watch you?" And he was very, he said, "Sure. Yeah, I'm teaching this insurance company, their top 100 managers. And why don't you just come and watch what I do?" So you got to remember that I'm a doctoral student. I was probably in my second year. So I had taken lots of courses on statistical analysis. I had read all of his books and articles, and I was used to this term called citations, where you would reference the work of others, and you even give the date in which they had these brilliant insights. So I walked into the room. It was an amphitheater. And of course, I was probably the youngest person in the room. They all looked very executive-like and quite serious. And I went to the back and I sat down, and John walked into the center of the amphitheater. And he opened with a story, which was a story about the CEO of Eastern Airlines, who was an astronaut named Frank Borman. And it was paradoxically, Frank Borman took Eastern Airlines into bankruptcy. So having an astronaut as your CEO proved not to be a good idea, despite the fact they all left gravity and went around the Earth. But he told this great story about how Borman unintentionally destroyed the company. So I thought, well, that's a great way to begin. But then he told another story. And at the end of an hour, I realized that Cotter had told like at least a dozen stories. He had shared almost none of his research. He had this 1 2x2 simple framework that he used to distinguish managing from leading. But the audience didn't get any of the kind of important background. What were the studies like? What were the sample sizes? What were kind of the key insights? And halfway through, I thought to myself, gosh, are these people getting their money's worth? They're just getting a long but wonderful string of stories. And at the end, they applauded him on and on and on. And that was an epiphany for me. because suddenly I realized that all this knowledge I had from all the quote, long history of research and leadership was actually not very useful if you wanted to convey it. What you had to do is turn it into story form, and that would not only engage your audiences, but it would stick with them. The problem I had was that no doctoral program taught how to do stories, other than the fact that I was at the Harvard Business School, and the key to the pedagogy was the case method. And what is a case? It's a 15 to 30 page story. And it dawned on me, no wonder he was a good storyteller, because the whole institution was built around this idea of you originally reading rich cases about characters and then taking their lessons with you. So what I did is I began to kind of read up on storytelling. I did read Joseph Campbell's work, and I sort of watched people like Stephen Jobs, who in many ways were masterful at what we call strategic storytelling. And then because I went pretty quickly into executive education, I got to watch the few senior leaders who use stories. There weren't many. It was pretty rare. It was clearly kind of against the grain to tell stories. But I watched what they did, and they had great stories. And so I began to use them in my own work. And then I became really interested in kind of the science behind stories. So I began to look at memory and why you remember stories. And then I began to look at neuroscience and why, if you include kind of vivid descriptions, people get deeper into the story. And it's because roughly, and it's very rough, about 60% of the brain's processing is visual. And so the more you can create visual imagery for the brain, the more it gets captivated and enjoys the story or gets pulled in, like a good movie. And so I really kind of stumbled on its importance. Although what I would later realize is I had been an anthropology major. And if you think about it, all cultures convey their core mythologies, as Joseph Campbell would say, through stories. And stories, we're swimming in stories. And yet most of us don't realize how powerful they are, nor are we taught how to use them. And then we go up against a popular stereotype, which is the uncle who is at some event like a marriage, and he's slapping you on the back and he's telling you another self-centered story about when he did something goofy at a football game or something like that. So sometimes we have kind of a somewhat negative connotation about the storyteller.
So this is also rich, right? So like what makes a good story? First of all, what is a story, right? And then what makes a good one? And then when you talk about strategic storytelling, what does that mean?
Great. So we'll start with what is a story? So a story if you strip it to its core, it's a narrative about some event. And so the kind of classic story has a simple form. There's a beginning, some type of event, which then sends the cast of characters into usually some type of journey, like the hero's journey. But the hero's journey is a very elaborate story. Most stories are far simpler. In that journey, something's going to happen to the character or characters. And then there's an outcome. So Little Red Riding Hood is on her way to Granny's house. She's got this lovely basket full of food that she's taking her grandmother. And it looks like a normal Saturday walk to Granny's, except this time, as she's in the forest, a wolf comes up to her. By the way, the wolf is very polite. He's very gentlemanly, and he even asks her, where are you going? And of course, he's so wonderfully polite that she says, well, I'm going to 1629 9th Street where my grandmother lives. So the little girl actually tells the wolf where to go. And so that's a very important first step. Then she gets to the house, which is where the key event occurs. Granny is looking a little unusual today. Little Red notices the nose is much longer, got a little more hair on it than it should have. Granny's eyes are much, much larger than they've ever been, and they have a shine that she's never quite seen before. And then, of course, the closing is that she notices that Granny's teeth now have a little bit more of an edge than they've ever had. That is the kind of pivotal moment. And in the Western version of Little Red Riding Hood, fortunately, there's a huntsman right outside the window who has been watching all this, breaks the window, and kills the wolf. In the Russian version, actually, the wolf eats the little girl, and it ends badly. and I've always liked the Russian version because I think that's closer to reality. Bad people are going to do bad things. You're not likely to have a huntsman in the neighborhood. So that's a classic story, beginning, middle, end, as a kind of a lesson, in this case, an epiphany for the little girl. And that's a story, of course, we tell primarily to our daughters to warn them. It's a beautiful story because it tells you that most bad people will come to you initially in a very friendly way. So as you're walking home from school, a van will pull up. A very nice man will offer you a ride, or he'll offer you some candy. And the story reminds the little girl, don't get in the van. This is all contrived. It's not going to end well. And then the other aspect, I don't want to go too far into it, but because she's wearing red, it says, don't stand up. Don't dress flamboyantly. Be very careful. There are wolves. So what you're trying to do with the story is you're really trying to capture a narrative. Most stories have a lesson, although some people tell stories that are just silly. And so the lesson is just get a good laugh out of you. And then, of course, they vary in length. A movie is a 2-hour story. A case study at Harvard is a good half-hour read. A great novel is a 10-hour story. And a story you and I might tell to teach people or to lead people might be 2 minutes, 3 minutes, max 4 minutes. You would tell them to potentially in the leadership capacity to spark action or communicate who you are as a leader, or to convey a core value you want everybody to embrace, or to encourage collaboration and teamwork, or often to share knowledge about something. So they tend to be very good for leaders to use. I think your other question is, well, why would you? How do you construct them? Or why
what makes a good story, and how do you construct one?
Yeah. So again, the classic have a fairly clear beginning. The best have in the middle of the story this crescendo, which is usually about conflict or tension. And then as that story is resolved, that conflict or tension is resolved, there's an epiphany. And that's the ending, where people will come out of the story with the epiphany. That said, if you were Stephen Jobs and you're doing a strategic story, it's a simpler format, but it has to be a little more compellingly conveyed because you're making an argument for the future. And their stories have a description of today, the status quo, and usually all of its shortcomings. What's missing? And then the story gives you the future as envisioned by the leader and why that's the place to go. And so the story is about our journey as a team or organization from the status quo into this very attractive future. But the best strategic narratives also describe what it's going to take on our part to make the journey. And that could be both in terms of values and activities and mindsets. And then those are described very vividly. So you can really kind of tangibly see both the current shortcomings, but tangibly imagine achieving the future outcome. So that's how you construct it now. The question would be, well, where the hell do I get these stories from? So I pick up many of my stories just from interactions. So I just opened with a John Cotter story. I realized I needed a story to capture why I became interested in stories. So I thought about that one. I'll often borrow stories that I've read or I've heard people tell that I think are very relevant, or I'll turn a personal experience into a wonderful story. I begin by always asking myself, well, what do I need a story for? I don't tell a story because I think it's a great story. I would say, well, what do I want to convey here? And then
It
I'll
always
start,
has an intention.
yeah, you have to have clarity about what's the purpose of the story. And then if you feel you don't have any at hand, then you go searching. I mean, you could literally go on the internet. I read a lot of biographies, so they're often great stories that I'll share from individuals who are facing opportunities or challenges, and I'll retell those.
Mhm.
The key, though, is how do you make them compelling and memorable? And there you have to go to the world of memory, the science of memory and neuroscience. And so you have to think of a story as a flight simulator. So when I was telling you about John Cotter, did you visualize the amphitheater?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what was the dress of the insurance executives? What were they wearing?
A lot of them were bald, and they were wearing white button-down shirts that they had ties on, and they'd taken off their jackets. Right.
So I didn't give you any of that, but by describing a few details, you filled in the blanks. That's what I want to do now. I don't want to give you any details that could be distracting from the story. So if I'd said I walked in and every single person in the room was wearing shiny black shoes, well, you would have visualized that, but that has no relevance to the story. Now, if I wanted you to get a better sense of Cotter, I might have said, in comes this very serious, suited, paper thin individual with just a hint of a smile on the right corner of his lip. So that I would use to give you a sense that something's going to happen, that there's something afoot. There's a bit of mischief here. I've described this kind of serious character, but by giving you, I could see this little peaky smile edging out of the right side of his mouth. I could give you little clues like that. Could you visualize all that?
Sure.
Yeah. So I'd put you in the flight simulator, and now I'm going to take you on the flight. So what we're trying to do is give you aspects of the landscape and of the cockpit that then bring you into the story. The reason stories work memory-wise is because they stimulate all your senses. So you think about a PowerPoint slide, it stimulates just your cognitive side and maybe a little bit of the visual side because it's this picture, it's this grid or a lot of words. But basically those are too abstract for the brain to have a lot of interest. And that's why we all get bored with PowerPoint. I always say the main person who wants PowerPoint is the speaker. And that's because they can't remember all their stuff. And so they're using it as a memory crutch. So you can imagine what that's doing to the poor audience, particularly when the presenter is reading from all that. So what you're trying to do is take the brain and the heart and the feet and the stomach into the story. So most people think of stories as a set of words, but it's actually you're moving the audience from imagery to imagery to imagery. So always say a great storyteller is actually visually moving you through the scenes. So when I think of story, I'm always thinking, right, how do I want to construct this scene at the beginning, this scene in the middle, and this scene at the end? And by using that analogy that you're constructing images or scenes, you automatically begin to convey the story more visually, which then gets the audience more engaged. The other thing I'm always thinking of is there's a emotional journey. And so I'm always asking myself, what are the emotions I want in that opening scene, in the next scene, and in the third or closing scene? So I'll literally call out, I want them to feel warned and a sense of urgency. I'll want them to feel high anxiety in the middle. And literally, I'll be on the edge of their seat. And then at the close, I want them to feel empowered and a sense that they can pull off what I'm going to ask them to do. So you're a bit like advertisers use the storyboards. You have a visual storyboard that you're creating for your story, and you have an emotional storyboard that you're creating for your story. And most people who tell stories don't think in these terms. But if you do, it makes your stories more powerful.
That's really beautiful. So mapping it visually, then mapping it emotionally, and like, where are they energetically? And then how do you come up with a good ending? You know, that's always I kind of just leave that kind of okay, that's all. That's it for today, folks. But you know what I know that's terrible, but what's a good ending? You kind of hinted at it as a kind of call to action, but say more about that.
So what you're trying to do with a good ending is create what's called a gap. A gap is really important. And in movies, movie producers who do really great, like sci-fi movies or horror movies or thrillers, usually have a gap. So you go in expecting X, but the story delivers Y. You go, whoa, what happened there? But if you're in a leadership role, you usually want that to lead to a call for action. So almost all stories leaders tell have, we got to do this, or we got to think like this, or act like this. But I'll share with you a story, and it'll illustrate everything I've just shared with you, as well as one other principle, which is really important, which is you tell your stories in the first person. Try not to tell your stories in the past. If you tell them in the present tense, the audience goes deeper into the flight simulator. So this is a true story, and I will use it to teach students and managers about the importance of direction. So many years ago, I was asked to go speak to an organization up in Burbank. And you know, I live in Los Angeles, and I live quite a ways away from Burbank. And so they said, Jay, can we send you a car to get you up here? And I said, that would be great. I'd love a car. And so they sent a sedan to pick me up. And where I live in LA, I never see celebrities. So I'm like celebrity starved. I've heard they live here, but I can't see them. So I asked the driver, I said, you know, I'm just curious, have you had any celebrities? And he laughed. And I said, why are you laughing? He said, well, I'm going to tell you a true story that happened to me recently. And I own this business. I'm the owner of the service. And we had met before I got in the car, and he was really just a wonderful, playful character. And he said, my favorite artist in the world is Prince. And we got a call a couple months ago from Prince's home asking for a car and driver. So the dispatcher knew that I loved Prince. So he said, boss, do you want to go pick up Prince? We just got a request. And he said, I'm on it. I'm on it. Get me that address. I'm on it. So he said, I drove up to Prince's house, and I arrived at the front of the house. And he said, it was kind of shocking. He said, Prince has this huge door, because you know how tall Prince is. He was quite short. And so he's kind of taken aback by the fact it's kind of like a Versailles style door. So he rings the bell, a valet appears, and he said, I'm here to pick up Mr. Prince. A few minutes later, Prince comes with valet, and the Sam, who owns the business, puts his hand out and says, Mr. Prince, I am such a fan of your music. It is just great to meet you today. And Prince does not take his hand. And he looks at him with a scolding face, and he says, to you, I am the artist formerly known as Prince, and I would like you to address me in that manner. So as Sam said to me, he said, you know, I was a little bit dashed, and I thought, oh, shoot. This is not quite the guy I was hoping he would be. But he said, I'm used to celebrities. So, and he said, many times they like their privacy and they don't like overly enthusiastic people. So I ushered him in the back of the car. And he said, Jay, the driveway out of the property is a couple minutes. He says, it's a long driveway. And we've gone 2 minutes. I'm not yet at the exit gate. And I say, artist, formerly known as Prince, where would you like me to go today? And he says to me, he says, I will let you know in a minute. So I arrive at the gate and I've got a choice here. He hasn't said where, but I figure if he's going to tell me when he wants to, so I take a right. And I can see a stop sign coming up. We've gone 2 or 3 blocks. He hasn't said anything. So I say, artist, formerly known as Prince, could you help me in terms of where you'd like to go? At which point Prince puts his hands to his forehead and he says, pay attention. I am sending you the directions via telepathy. So Sam said to me, he said, Jay, it wasn't coming through. So I said to him, I said, artist formerly known as Prince, this part of Beverly Hills, there's so many wavelengths from other people. I am not able to pick up your telepathy. It's a lot of interference today, just tremendous amount of interference. Could you just tell me where you'd like to go? And he said, at that point, I reached to the stop sign and I had to brake because now I got 3 choice points here in front of me. And Prince said, get the message. He wasn't going to tell me. So I said, well, if you can't tell me, I have to take you home. And he said, look, I will fire you if you don't pay attention to my telepathy. At which point, Jay, I said, look, you know, I love your music. You're an amazing artist, but I'm taking you home. You can't fire me because I own the business. So with that, he turns the car around, goes back through the gate and drops Prince off at his house. Now, to make the story even more intriguing is 3 months later, there was another organization somewhere else in LA who asked me to come and do a workshop for them, and they sent me a car. And again, I'm desperate because I live in an area where there are no celebrities. So I said, this driver's named Joe. I said, hey, Joe, have you had any celebrities? And he said, well, I've had a lot of celebrities, but I just had a really weird one. And I said, really? Who was that? He said, Prince. And I said, what? He said, Prince. I said, well, what was so weird about him? Well, he got in my car and he never told me where to go. So I was just driving around. And then 10 minutes in, he said, you're fired. Take me back to my home. And I called Mark, our dispatch, and I said, Mark, I've just been fired. And Mark started breaking into laughter. And I said, why are you laughing at me, Mark? I've just been fired by Prince. He said, I got news for you. You're the 3rd driver he's fired today. And he just asked for another one. And I said, I got to tell you what he's doing. He is practicing his telepathy on you, and you are not a good receptor. So he's just looking to find somebody who will pick up on his telepathy. And so I will often use that story. So that's the gap, of course, there is that you're not expecting Prince to be sending messages via telepathy. And then the other gap is you're not expecting the driver to turn around and drop him back at his home. So you have 2 wonderful gaps. You'll notice I told it in the first tense, present tense, as if it's actually unfolding. And I give you 2 versions, Sam interacting with Prince, and then Sam interacting with me. So you're kind of going in and out. I've given you just enough information. You could see the red stop sign, correct? Mm. And what was the style of the gate that you visualized?
Yeah, wrought iron.
Uh-huh. And what was the style of the house?
Some palatial, disgusting thing. You know?
Okay. So I've also gave you a long driveway. Did you visualize what the driveway looked like? Or
it curved and it had really a good topiary on the side of it.
Great. And then the final thing is, were you in the car or were you outside the car?
In the car.
Okay. What color was the car, by the way?
Black, of course.
A stretch or a sedan?
I'd say a sedan.
Yeah. Now, I didn't give you any of that, but that's where most people go.
Right.
There are a few people who watch through the window of the car and see it unfolding. the call to action in that story, I actually will tell that story to a group of people who are in leadership roles. And I'll say that you and I are Prince. We hold meetings, big meetings. We call everybody to a town hall. We say, here's what we want you to do. We give them too much information. We don't give them a lot of clarity either. They leave that meeting. They go out of the gate. They can't remember really, are we supposed to go right or left? They hit a stop sign, which might be a client that's disgruntled. They don't remember. And you, because you're so in this information, you thought you communicated it, you're going, can't they read my mind? Don't they know where they're going? How could they make these mistakes? And as Stephen Jobs said, I communicate the vision till I'm nauseous with it. When I can't stand saying the vision anymore, I know that that's the point at which it's first being heard. And so I will often use that story to back up the point that you can never communicate enough as a leader. And don't think because you had that meeting back in April that they still can read your mind, because they can't. And they're going to hit obstacles in their journey that you need to help them understand what they are and help remind them what the actions are.
So it's interesting that we encode things in story, right? And as a parent, I've discovered that if I give an order, it usually goes unheard, let alone unresponded to. But if I create a narrative, it's effortless.
Yes.
So I have learned now years ago to stop saying, hey, brush your teeth. And now I say, and we're here for the Hunter family evening toothbrush playoffs. And first up is young Mr. Hunter. And then he stands up in front of the mirror. He holds his toothbrush in the air and I said, are you ready? And then we go through this whole thing and he brushes his teeth and we're good.
Yeah. So you made it an event.
Made it an event.
A playful event.
A playful event.
And potentially a little bit of a competitive event. Yeah.
Then because he's also competing against all the kids in the neighborhood who are all, fictitious creations of my mind.
Yeah.
But and he'll ask, how are they doing? I realized that's when I started to see the power of story. Like to motivate action in a way that wasn't about coercion. Right.
It's very powerful. And it's so funny that we don't use them more frequently. And I've asked audiences, why don't you? And what they've told me is, and they vary, but some feel they'll look silly. Some feel they just aren't competent enough. Some feel they don't know where they would find a story. Some feel that they would use the wrong story. Some people don't realize that stories can be real life examples. They think of stories as like Little Red Riding Hood.
I see.
Or a movie or a novel. But I would argue every day you have raw material for a story. Your whole day, there is the material. You may not use it, but there's a lot.
That's fascinating, and then, Yuval Harari's book, Homo Deus, seems to be all about like over stories, elites have used to control the masses, right? In some ways, right? And that the stories are now conflicting now with one another, but give people a story.
That's right. QAnon. Just think about a lot of conspiracy theories. There are incredible narratives that are used as propaganda. Yeah,
and QAnon in particular, interestingly enough, I mean, it just seems it's just a real life video game, right? And and shares some elements with that, it seems like. So, yeah, this is really fascinating. And what is it about narrative structure that is so compelling for people?
Well, again, it's the fact that it stimulates all your senses. So, and probably the first sense it has to is, well, both ideally would be one, either intrigue or heartstrings and visuals. So you always want to be asking yourself again, you're not moving from part one to part two, part three, you're moving from image to image to image. And so you always have to be asking yourself, all right, what's the imagery I need here? And again, the audience will fill in some of that for you. So you don't, I didn't need to tell you it was a stretch limo or a black car or what the driver was wearing. You're going to do all that for me automatically. So I'm not focused on that. I'm really thinking about, all right, what are the core scenes that I need to build this story around?
It's interesting. I was sitting in on a panel on, I wasn't part of the panel, just watching it on climate change like a couple of weeks ago. And all the panelists had were data.
That's
and not only can I not remember anything from that, but I can remember sitting in it thinking, what a disaster. not just because of climate change, but because of this panel. You know, you had people who were supposedly world leaders in their domain who had things we should know, and yet they had no way of effectively telling that story, let alone it leading to some kind of action.
This is one of my major concerns about the whole climate movement, that many of their proponents, the scientists, don't have the ability to tell compelling narratives. And then the other thing is many of them they haven't thought through the call to action for ordinary people. So the call to action in most climate change is government interventions or radical new technologies or ending fossil fuel. And there's some truth to those, but you don't get engaged unless you bring this story into the lives of everyday people. And so the ability to kind of tie climate change, not to the polar bears, but to somebody living in Pasadena. Why should I be concerned? I've got air conditioning. How am I seeing climate change show up in my neighborhood? And this is one of my main criticisms of that whole movement. So not only have they not been able to tell a narrative that has widespread appeal, but then they've not been able to frame the call to action in individual citizens. There are people who say, go out and buy solar panels. Yes, and I went out and bought solar panels, but I'm a percentage of the population that can afford to buy solar panels. A lot of people can't. So is really one of the solutions to cut back on the number of hamburgers I eat each week? Probably. And that would be something you and I could each do without a lot of cost. So this is why in leadership and social movements, the stories are really key. And but there can be misused. I'm just finishing this book called Bad Blood, which is about Elizabeth Holmes of Theranos, the woman who was, in theory, building this ability to test your blood at minute levels, and then that would be used to tailor your medications. Well, it turned out the whole thing was a fabrication. She couldn't create this product, but she was a very effective storyteller. And she pulled from Steve Jobs, not only his wardrobe, but his kind of intensity. And then she even designed the products to look like Apple products because she was playing off of the Apple story. And she was able to build a very impressive board. Henry Kissinger, as I recall, was on there, all sorts of very world famous people. So the stories are used also to create negative outcomes.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting that there are political differences in how stories are used. I find liberals tend to not use them, and they use data and argument, whereas conservatives tend to be much more effective at telling compelling, action motivating stories.
Yeah, I read a wonderful book on Ronald Reagan, because of course Reagan is known for his storytelling ability. And he learned that. And this is the most important lesson I can have for your audience, that everybody can learn how to be a good storyteller. It's not, you don't have to have the right disposition or genetics. So Ronald Reagan, as his his cinema career was peaking. He was invited by General Electric to go to the plants and speak to the workers. The head of HR said, you know, I want a motivational speaker for my plants. And I think it was on his first plant or early on. He didn't have a lot of success. The speech just didn't go very well. They weren't so interested in the old movie stars and life in Hollywood. These were, you know, people living in the Midwest, and while they love movies, they probably were interested in the current cast of stars. So one of his favorite periodicals that he read was Reader's Digest. And on one of the flights to one of the plants, he just finished reading a couple stories. And so just out of, I think, frustration, he told one of the stories. And the audience really resonated. And so he decided to experiment with increasing the story content. And his original source was the Reader's Digest. So he plucked these stories from the Reader's Digest, which conveyed something he wanted to convey. And he did this for multiple years, and he became a great storyteller because he realized how he could use them to move his audiences. The other part of the book was that he moved from being a very liberal Democrat to a very conservative Republican because GE was trying to avoid unionization. And the head of HR was trying to encourage Ronald that unions were a bad idea and that he could play a role in helping him dissuade the workforces to unionize.
Can you say more about the call to action and like what is that? And then I don't know if I asked this, but I don't remember the answer yet. But and then what makes a good ending, right? And how do you think about a good ending?
So one of the most powerful speeches that I've ever seen is Robert Kennedy he's running for president, and he's in Indianapolis. And when he's coming from another location, and as he's getting on the plane, he will learn that Martin Luther King has been shot. They don't know his condition, but during the flight, a couple of reporters will come down and tell him that King is in critical condition. And then I think he either learns when the plane is about to land or on landing, and the chief of police of Indianapolis says, you can't do your rally for president. It's too dangerous, because the first rally was going to be in the Black community of Indianapolis. But Robert decides to go, and he trashes his presidential speech. And he does something incredibly courageous. This is before the era of the internet and, you know, news moving fast. Nobody knows that King has been shot. Nobody knows that King has died. And he opens by saying, I have some terrible news I want to share with you tonight. And that is that Martin Luther King has been shot and killed. And that's where he begins. And you just hear the audience moaning in just deep sadness and shock. His call to action is really what makes the speech incredible. He says, you know, we can go down the path of destruction and hatred. And by the way, my brother was killed by a white man. And I know the anger that you feel. I know what it's like to lose somebody so important to you. Or we can go down the path of peace and respect and admiration for one another, which, by the way, is going to be a much more challenging path, full of setbacks. But Martin Luther King would have told us that that is the path to follow, nonviolence. And so as I close tonight, it was only a 4-minute speech. I have to paraphrase it, but it's something like, remember the vision of Dr. King. You have a choice. And Indianapolis became the only major city in the United States that had no widespread rioting.
Wow.
And that was his call to action, which is remember the vision, which is nonviolence. So the call to action can be something like that, but oftentimes the call to action is, you know, like a mindset that people need, or Or, like a very simple story, like, do you remember Nordstrom's call to action was the customer's always right? And so they would always tell stories about crazy customer stuff that was honored. So one man brought back 4 tires. And so the person who was handling the return turned to a colleague or the boss and said, "We don't sell tires." And the guy said, "Well, the customer's always right. Give him his money." And so they took the tires and gave him the money. And that was a story they used to tell because it was at the other extreme. But that would be a call to action, which is this real simple story, which is the customer is indeed always right, even when they're wrong. Then you have like the kid stories where your call to action is brush your teeth with your son. Little Red Riding Hood is be super aware of people who you don't know. Pay so much attention to little things that are off, like Granny's nose.
Right, details matter.
Yeah.
Interesting. So it's asking, it's kind of giving a map for what you want the listener to do.
Yeah. And again, it could be very concrete through an actual event. So you might want more teamwork and collaboration in your organization, and you could use 2 stories. You could use a story. You don't want to use a story that blames people, but you could talk about, I witnessed this event in 2 teams that are working together, and here's what happened. They dropped the ball, and here's how that happened. Here's the inciting event. And by the way, here was the outcome. And now let me tell you another story about these 2 teams who actually overcame that event. And here's how they did it. And here's their outcome. And so let's always remember these as we go forth in this journey of collaboration across the organization. We want to stay on this side of the equation. We do know that if you're in a leadership role, the beauty of a tangible story like that is it helps people know what they need to do in concrete actions.
Right.
I've worked with a lot of banks who always say there's a huge period where they all use the same slogan: "We are one bank." Well, nobody knew what that meant. And the 1 or 2 banks that I did some work for who people really understood with, because the CEO gave them lots of really rich, simple stories of what one bank looked like all the way at the bottom or at the mid-levels, and what it did not look like at the bottom or the mid-level. And so you can use stories to really bring home these abstract mission or strategic initiatives.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was working with a client this year and last year, and as they kind of faced COVID, and the managing partner kind of pulled out of his desk drawer their value statement. Like, he should let these guide our actions. And he said, we've made this tremendous investment in understanding what our values actually are, to the point of exactly what you're saying, of if we are living our values, we do things like this, we say things like this, right? We treat each other in this way. So that abstract value statement, like nourishing positive relationships, right, is spelled out. What does that look like? And
that's
really
one
of their best years ever last year.
So important. And that's something a lot of people in leadership roles don't appreciate, particularly the more senior ones. They fall in the abstraction trap.
Like, what does that mean, right?
Yeah. Now, the other thing we haven't talked about, and I'll highlight as we come to the end here, which is you want to use your voice. So we haven't talked too much about delivery, other than the fact I said, tell it in the present tense. But your voice is very important. And I've just illustrated a couple of the principles. What did I just do, Jeremy?
Slowed things down. You changed the volume, right, a little bit.
That's right. So voice pacing, voice variety is really important. Sometimes I'll even use, if it's a international story, I'll even use the accent of the characters. I don't know why, but that seems to work really well, provided you don't don't do a poor job at the accent. Pacing is very important. So there might be places where you speed up, and then you have a pause. Pausing is really important. Pausing like potentially gets the audience, well, what's going to happen? So pausing, pacing, and then the final thing is what we call word groups. So word groups is how you cluster the words. And I just did it for you. Word groups is how you cluster the words. So you see, I actually broke that down into 4 word groupings. And one of them was just the word cluster. And then I closed with the final word grouping, which is the words, because that's really what I want you to remember. I want you to remember that putting words together in groups to emphasize them potentially makes the story more engaging.
Because it's kind of bold-facing verbally what you want to say.
That's right. That's exactly it. And you're doing it through your voice, and you're bracketing it with pauses. You can bracket it with gestures.
That's amazing. So just to recap, okay. So stories are powerful because we remember them more than we remember abstract data, right? A good story will involve multiple senses. It has an intention, like what is it you want to say? It has a beginning, middle, and end where there's some kind of conflict or tension that needs to be resolved, right? What else? You were talking about, it ends with, you talked about moving from image to image to image, rather than data point, data point, data point. So image to image to image, and then make an emotional map.
That's right.
What do you feel here? What do you feel here? What do you feel at the end? And then the call to action ideally is the kind of inspiring,
getting you
energizing
to go do something. Yeah. And then the final thing is, remember, your voice is like a musical instrument. And in a way, a good story is a little bit like this very compressed symphony. And so you want a bit of adagio, allegro, a bit of adagio. And the voice allows you to communicate the emotional tenor as well.
So it's like the background music in a way, right? So,
yeah, and in a strange way, it's actually more foreground than you would imagine.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. No, I'm thinking about in the way that the background music of a movie, tells you here's what to feel right now, right?
Yeah. Which is like, oh my God, something's about to happen, or oh, we're through the worst. You can laugh now. Yeah,
that's really powerful. That's really powerful. You truly are a master teacher.
Oh, thank you.
You really are.
I love teaching. It's I've always said I think my gift was to translate complexity for people, because I'm at heart a simpleton, and I need to figure this stuff out. So by the time I've worked through it, I'm able to communicate it to most people.
What does that mean?
And that's right. And then I really discovered that if you want to be an exceptional leader and exceptional teacher as a communicator, you have to learn how to do storytelling. It's essential.
Yeah, that's spectacular. And yeah, it's such a essential thing, right? I mean, that's what this podcast is supposed to be all about, right? It's like this essential thing in life that nobody ever teaches you how to do, right?
That's right. And and that's the paradox. They don't teach teachers. They don't teach people in leadership roles. There are these storytelling festivals, and you can buy books on storytelling. And there are a few that are quite good. And there are a few schools, universities that do teach storytelling. I think University of Tennessee is one, but they're very few and rare. And they tend to be more around kind of courses on folklore. And courses on mythology, like the Joseph Campbell hero's journey. So they tend to be kind of more focused on a particular domain of storytelling.
as opposed to a kind of pragmatic tool.
Yeah.
You can,
Mhm.
interesting. Well, let's put a bookmark here, and with the assumption we are going to pick up on some other, because you are just a font of wisdom, and I know you're having met with many of your students. I know that many of them just really appreciate.
Well, and that's high praise from an outstanding teacher. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, folks at home, you can tell we have a mutual admiration.
We have a lot of admiration for one another. Yeah. we're both individuals with missions, purpose-driven.
Right. And a lot of Chinese food in our background. Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to the podcast. Give us a review and tell us your thoughts. The best thing you can do is share this with someone who would find it interesting and helpful. If you have an idea for other topics you'd like to explore, please let us know. Contact me at info@jeremyhunter.net. Thank you to the multi-talented Mr. Jason Beck for making the magic happen behind the scenes. And our music is the creation of Jeffrey with a G Munger. You can learn more about his work at kettleblackmusic.com.